You're listening to the Law of Attraction Radio Network.
The secret to well-being is discovering the power that is your birthright, the power to create a happier, healthier life drawn from our own vast internal resources. Join Jules and her guests as they gently guide you to shift your perspective from the familiar negative to the divinely connected, a place that will not only positively impact your world, but possibly shift the planet. It's all right here on Law of Attraction Talk Radio.
Welcome to Law of Attraction Talk Radio. I'm your host, Jules Johnson. Today we're exploring one of the most profound spiritual teachings about healing, consciousness, and the nature of divine reality. Our guest today is spiritual teacher Joel Goldsmith, founder of the message known as the Infinite Way. Joel's teachings have influenced spiritual seekers around the world, and tonight we're going to explore the deeper principles behind spiritual healing. Joel, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here and to share these ideas.
Joel, let's begin with the central idea in your work. You often say that healing takes place through the conscious knowing of truth. For listeners who may be hearing this for the first time, what exactly does that mean?
Healing, as we understand it in the Infinite Way, is not based on willpower or personal belief. It comes through a realization of spiritual truth. When consciousness awakens to the presence of God as the only life and the only power, the discords that appear in human experience begin to dissolve.
So healing is really a shift in consciousness. It's not about fixing conditions, but about realizing a deeper spiritual truth.
Exactly. When we realize that God is the only power, the appearance of discord loses its foundation.
Many people today explore several spiritual systems at once. They combine affirmations, visualization, prayer, and different metaphysical teachings. Does that approach help people achieve spiritual healing?
In most cases, it actually prevents the results they are seeking. When different metaphysical systems are mixed together, the clarity of each principle becomes blurred. In the Infinite Way, we remain centered on one realization, that God is the only presence and the only power.
Joel, something else you teach often surprises people. You say that when someone seeks spiritual healing, you are not interested in knowing the person's name or even the name of the disease. For many listeners, that sounds very unusual. Why would the name of the illness not matter?
Because the name of the disease has no spiritual significance. When someone asks for help, what is really taking place is a union of consciousness between the practitioner and the individual seeking healing. The healing does not come from analyzing conditions. It comes from realizing the presence of God as the only power and the only reality.
So the focus is not on the problem itself, but on realizing spiritual truth. In other words, the healing takes place as consciousness aligns with that truth.
Exactly. When consciousness recognizes the presence of God, the discord that seemed so real begins to dissolve. It dissolves because it never had true power or true substance to begin with.
Earlier in your life, before you fully understood these principles, healing was already occurring through you. That must have been a remarkable experience. Can you tell us how that began?
Yes, it was quite extraordinary. In the early years of my work, people were healed, even though I did not yet understand why those healings were taking place. Something within consciousness was active, and the results followed naturally. But eventually, that was not enough. I wanted to understand the principles behind it.
Joel, when you began searching for those principles, what were some of the ideas you encountered in the spiritual or metaphysical teachings of the time? Were they consistent with what you eventually discovered?
Not entirely. One of the first things I was taught was that in order to treat someone spiritually, you needed to know the person's name and the name of the disease. You were told to identify the illness and address it directly in your treatment.
That sounds very similar to traditional healing approaches where diagnosis becomes the central focus. But your teaching ultimately moved in a very different direction.
Yes, it did. Another idea I encountered was the belief that every physical illness had a mental cause behind it. For example, someone might say that a particular disease was caused by resentment, jealousy, anger, or some other mental condition.
And that explanation never resonated with you?
No, it did not. Something about that idea felt inconsistent with the deeper spiritual truth I was beginning to perceive. Eventually, I discovered that from the standpoint of spiritual realization, it is not correct to say that disease is caused by the individual mind.
That must have been a very important realization, because it completely changes how we view responsibility and healing.
Yes, it changes everything. The spiritual truth is that the discords appearing in human experience have nothing to do with the individual's true being. Our real identity is spiritual, and that identity is one with God.
Joel, this brings us to one of the most striking ideas in your teaching. You say that much of human suffering begins with the belief in two powers, good and evil. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is this. Human beings have accepted the belief that there are two forces governing life. One is called good, and the other is called evil. And once that belief is accepted, life becomes a struggle between opposites.
So instead of resting in one divine reality, people begin living as though life is divided between harmony and discord, health and disease, peace and fear.
Yes, exactly. And that divided way of seeing life is the root of human suffering. It is the acceptance of duality, the acceptance that evil has power, presence, law, or reality.
And you connect that directly to the story of the Garden of Eden. How should listeners understand that symbolism?
The Garden of Eden symbolizes the moment in consciousness when humanity accepted the knowledge of good and evil. It represents the moment when spiritual simplicity was exchanged for the belief in opposing powers. And from that acceptance came fear, conflict, shame, struggle, and the whole appearance of separation from God.
Now, in your view, the problem is not that evil is actually a real power, but that humanity has believed it to be one.
That is correct. The belief gives it an appearance of reality, but not actual reality. As long as a person believes in two powers, life is lived under tension. But when one awakens to the realization that God is the only power, that whole structure begins to collapse.
That shifts the entire approach to healing, doesn't it? Because now the goal is no longer to fight one power with another, but to awaken to the fact that there is only one.
Yes, that is the beginning of spiritual freedom. The moment you understand that God alone is power, you begin to step out of the conflict created by human belief.
Joel, earlier you mentioned that the body itself is not the true source of life. You often use a very simple illustration about the human hand to explain this idea. Could you share that with our listeners?
Yes, it's a very simple illustration, but it reveals something important. My hand, by itself, is neither good nor evil. It is simply an instrument. If my hand gives something to another person, it is not really the hand doing the giving. And if my hand strikes someone, it is not the hand that is evil. The hand is simply the instrument through which the individual acts.
So the instrument itself is completely neutral. It simply expresses whatever direction consciousness gives it.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to the entire human body. The organs of the body are not inherently sick, and they are not inherently healthy. They are instruments. The real life of the body is the consciousness that animates it. In other words, there is a life within us that gives the body its movement, its expression, and its direction.
That completely reverses the way most people think about the body. Many people feel as though the body controls their life, but you're saying the body is actually the instrument of a deeper spiritual life.
Yes, the body is the instrument. The true life is the divine life within us. And when we begin to understand that, our entire relationship to health, to fear, and to limitation begins to change.
Joel, when people begin to understand that the body is simply an instrument, it naturally raises a deeper question. If the body is the instrument, then what is the true identity that animates it? Who are we really?
That is the central question of spiritual realization. When we turn away from the purely material sense of life and begin to look spiritually, we discover something very surprising. We discover that our true identity is not merely the human personality. The true I is the expression of divine life itself. In other words, our real being is one with God.
So the deeper realization is that life is not something we possess individually. It is something that flows through us from the divine source.
Exactly. God constitutes our life, our mind, our soul, and even the substance of our being. When this realization dawns, we begin to see ourselves in an entirely different way. Instead of living as a separate individual, trying to overcome problems, we begin to live as the expression of a divine life that is already whole and already complete.
That realization must completely change how someone experiences life, because instead of feeling separate, they begin to feel connected to the source of life itself.
Yes, and when that realization deepens, fear begins to fall away, because we are no longer living as isolated individuals trying to survive. We are living in the awareness that divine life is expressing itself through us.
Hi there, Jules here. I just want to remind you, I'm a professional hypnotherapist with over 20 years of exceptional and extremely confidential services. Anything you think you can't do, be, or have, or are even afraid to achieve, can simply be resolved very fast. Not only can I help you break negative habits, but I can also help you live a more abundant life in love, in creating future wealth, or gaining high-paying employment. Contact me today and let's chat to see how I can help you achieve success or resolve long-standing issues by simply changing your thought process. Send me an email at jewel@LOARadionetwork.com. That's JEWEL at LOARadionetwork.com. I look forward to helping you achieve your most successful goals and dreams. Make a difference in your life. Contact Jules for a hypnotherapy session today. Joel, earlier you mentioned something called the carnal mind. Many spiritual traditions seem to refer to this idea in different ways. Could you explain what you mean by that term?
Yes. Throughout history, different spiritual teachings have used different words to describe the same idea. The Apostle Paul called it the carnal mind. Jesus sometimes referred to it as the devil. In modern metaphysical language, it is often called mortal mind. But regardless of the name, the meaning is the same.
So these different terms are really describing a single spiritual concept.
Exactly. The carnal mind represents the belief that life exists apart from God. It is the belief that there is a power separate from divine reality. Yet, when examined spiritually, that belief has no actual substance. It has no real law, no true power, and no divine authority.
So the difficulty people experience comes from believing that this influence is real, even though, from a spiritual standpoint, it has no genuine power.
Yes, that is exactly the point. Human experience appears difficult because people believe that discord has authority. But when consciousness awakens to the realization that God alone is power, that illusion begins to dissolve.
Joel, you've said that much of what people experience in everyday life comes from something you call universal suggestion. Sometimes you even describe it as a kind of collective hypnotism. What does that mean for the average person?
What it means is that human thought is constantly influenced by the beliefs of the world around us. From childhood forward, people absorb ideas about fear, limitation, disease, and struggle. These beliefs become so widely accepted that they appear to be facts about life. But spiritually speaking, they are often nothing more than suggestions that have been repeated until humanity believes them.
So people may actually be reacting to ideas they have absorbed from the collective thinking of the world, ideas they may never have questioned.
Yes, that is exactly the point. This universal belief system acts almost like a hypnotic influence. People accept its assumptions without realizing they have the ability to awaken from it.
An awakening from that influence is really what spiritual realization is about.
Yes, spiritual awakening is the recognition that divine consciousness is the true authority of life. When a person begins to live in that awareness, they are no longer governed by the hypnotic beliefs of the world. Instead, they begin to experience life from the standpoint of spiritual truth. And that shift in consciousness is where genuine freedom begins.
Joel, when someone begins to awaken from those collective beliefs of fear and limitation, what changes first? What does spiritual awareness begin to do inside the individual?
The first great change is that fear begins to loosen its hold. Because fear depends upon the belief that there is something apart from God that can govern life.
No, fear is sustained by the belief in separation. The moment that belief begins to dissolve, something within the person begins to relax.
Yes, exactly. When a person realizes that divine life is the only life, and divine presence is the only presence, they begin to feel an inward release. A strain that had been hidden in consciousness starts to melt away.
And that release is more than an emotional comfort. It is actually part of the healing itself.
Yes, inner peace is not merely a pleasant feeling. It is one of the signs that consciousness is coming back into alignment with what is spiritually true. And when that peace is present, discord begins to lose its foundation. Because the mind is no longer feeding the appearance of separation, struggle, or fear.
Peace itself becomes evidence that the person is awakening to a deeper spiritual reality.
That is right. Where spiritual awareness is present, fear cannot dominate. And where fear loses its hold, the individual begins to experience the liberty that comes from the presence of God.
Joel, when people hear about spiritual healing or divine realization, many immediately think of prayer. But the way you describe prayer sounds quite different from the traditional idea of asking God to change a situation. How do you understand prayer?
Prayer, in its deepest sense, is not asking God to do something that has not already been done. God's work is already complete. Divine life, divine harmony, and divine wholeness are already established. True prayer is the quiet turning of consciousness toward that realization. It is the willingness to recognize what is spiritually true.
No, instead of trying to persuade God to intervene, prayer becomes a moment of spiritual recognition.
Exactly. It is the quiet acknowledgement that God is already present as the life of our being. And in that recognition, the human sense of struggle begins to dissolve. Prayer is really a movement of consciousness from fear into spiritual awareness. And that awareness opens the door for harmony to appear in experience.
That makes prayer sound less like a request and more like an awakening.
Yes, prayer is awakening to the presence of God. And as that awakening deepens, life begins to reflect the harmony that was always present.
Joel, that is a beautiful way to understand spiritual practice, and I think it leads us naturally into a quiet moment of reflection for our listeners. Joel, thank you for sharing these insights with us today. Before we close the program, I'd like to invite our listeners to take a quiet moment with me. Just a few moments to let these ideas settle gently into awareness.
That is a beautiful way to conclude, because spiritual understanding deepens in moments of stillness.
If you're listening right now, wherever you may be, simply allow your mind to become quiet for a moment. Let the activity of the day softly fall into the background and bring your awareness inward. Consider the possibility that the life moving within you is not separate from the divine, that the presence of God is not distant but already here, expressing itself as your very being. For this moment, release the need to solve anything. Release the need to struggle or control. Simply rest in the awareness that divine life is present now. And in that quiet awareness, peace begins to unfold naturally, because peace is the natural expression of divine presence.
Yes, when consciousness rests in the awareness of God, the soul naturally finds peace.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you to everyone listening today. We'll close the program in just a moment. As we come to the close of today's program, I hope something in this conversation has touched your heart and opened a deeper space of reflection within you. Joel, thank you for being with us and for sharing these profound spiritual insights.
Thanks you, Jules. It has been a blessing to share this time with you and with everyone listening.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for spending this time with us here on Law of Attraction Talk Radio. Take these ideas with you into the rest of your day and allow them to unfold quietly in your own awareness. Sometimes the deepest transformation begins not in effort, but in stillness. And next week on LOA Radio, we'll continue our journey inward with another powerful conversation designed to deepen your awareness, elevate your understanding, and strengthen your connection to the life of spirit within you. You won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. I'm Jules Johnson, and this is Law of Attraction Talk Radio. Be still, be aware, and let truth reveal itself.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back next week with another great show from Law of Attraction Talk Radio. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send an email to jules@loaradionetwork.com and have a great week.